Yeah, that's big ground to cover in 20 minutes. But yeah, I mean, first of all, I really want to express my gratitude to the Sylvia Ioannou Foundation and all the participants in this 3-day conference. And as a young researcher, I have to say that I really have learned a lot. So, and I treasure the opportunity to dialogue with all of you, especially reflecting on the specificities of the Mediterranean Corso in the early modern period and until the early 19th century. And I think as many in this room have already discussed or pointed during their presentations, I think this is a particularly crucial operation today, insofar as the history of the Mediterranean Corso, and here I have the pleasure to quote the evocative phrasing that recently was offered by Maria Fusaro, has only recently entered the domain of historical research, as for a long time it was the dominion of fantasy and misunderstanding more than scholarship. So I can certainly say that this very conference has been, I think, an important contribution to the collective endeavor, which was first explicitly articulated by Gregory Fisher in the 1950s, that is, dispel the Barbary legend or the pirate legend and recover the forgotten history of the Mediterranean Corso. So what I would like to do today, nevertheless, is something slightly different, and I hope complementary. So rather than trying to dispel the Barbary legend, rather than trying to falsify popular pirate myths and find a way out of the dominion of fantasy and misunderstanding, I would ask you, for the short span of these 20 minutes, to linger in the space of myths, of fantasies and of legends. And I know what an uncomfortable kind of practice that might be for trained historians. So more than investigating, as many has done, the history of the Mediterranean Corso, I want to dedicate this time to the task of uncovering its spectral afterlife in a series of related historical discourses, and to understand what role the mythology, rather than the reality, of the Barbary Corsairs and in general of the Mediterranean Corso, what is the effect of that mythology and what is the effect of it on the international system since the 19th century. So to refer to the title of this panel, I want to focus the attention not on the pirates or on the courses, but on the pirate image continuously constructed and reconstructed by intertwining legal, political, historiographic, and popular discourses. So I think I consider the Barbary pirates in my book and in general in my talk today a legend, just as the infamous man to whom Michel Foucault in 1977 dedicated one of his most emotional pieces of writing. So why the Corsairs as a legend? I think, first of all, because in all legends there is a certain ambiguity between the fictional and the real. And I think throughout this 2 days conference, I think that kind of came out, the ambiguity between the fictional and the real. But more importantly, because the juridical, literary, political, and historiographical texts that we have analyzed, in which the Corsairs are variously portrayed either as apolitical pirates or as fanatic Ghazi, or as anti-colonial Turkish heroes, or as communist hostis omnium and enemies of humankind, all of this variety not only refer to a contested reality that certainly was there, but they are, and here I quote Foucault, directly operative within it. They form part of the dramaturgy of the real. They constitute the instrument of a retaliation, the weapon of a hatred, an episode in a battle, the gesticulation of a despair or a jealousy, an entreaty or an order. So I think when we read the proliferation of dubious portrayals of the Mediterranean Corso, especially after the 19th century, it must be remembered that whatever their inaccuracy, their exaggeration, or their hypocrisy, they are never neutral. They are discursive weapons in an always evolving matrix of power. So the question I will be really shortly focusing on is the following. How did the representation of the Barbary regencies changed between the 18th and the 19th century, and especially after the 19th century, after their demise? And how was the memory of the Mediterranean Corso evoked, exploited, manipulated, and made productive throughout the 19th and the 20th century? So to what extent the spectres projected by hegemonic narratives of a seemingly remote past continue to haunt our contemporary so-called globalized world? So in order to discuss this bundle of interrelated questions, I think a good starting point, as always, for me at least, is a working hypothesis that is originally presented by Fernand Braudel in his seminal La Méditerranée. So according to the French historian, it is possible to isolate a fundamental conceptual shift in Mediterranean history, which roughly corresponds with the so-called 17th century northern invasion of the Mediterranean. In the 7th chapter of the 2nd volume of La Méditerranée, I think Braudel makes two fundamental and related claims. The first is that, and here I quote again, in the Mediterranean, the concepts of piracy and of pirates are hardly ever used before the 17th century. People speak of privateers and corsairs, and the distinction clear on a juridical level as its importance. And I think that this first hypothesis is largely proved by the available documents. But here I would like to have a discussion. At least at the level of official discourse, the Barbary cities in the 18th century, although we have been discussing how they were treated and represented by the Ottoman Empire, I think in European sources are considered and represented as legitimate polities, at least until very late in the 18th century. In fact, although formally part of the Ottoman Empire, they were often treated by European countries as independent sovereign state, and a number of official treaties, as you know, were agreed between members of the European Community of Nations and the cities of the Barbary Coast. Now, I mean, obviously, we can't go into the detail of this diplomatic history, but just to cite some numbers, I think between 1703 and 1830, Algiers entered into 12 treaties with Great Britain, to 5 treaties with France, to which we should add treaties with Sweden, Holland, Austria, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, the two Sicilies, Sardinia, and the United States of America. So a similar list could be repeated for Tripoli, Tunis, and Morocco. So it is hard to deny that some form of mutual recognition grew out of a continuous conflict between the two shores of the Mediterranean. And in all of these documents, we hardly find traces of pirates, outlaws, enemies of all communities, and even less enemies of the human race. So I think, as Salvatore Bono once summarized, and I think as was really fantastically represented throughout the conference, Il Corso, the Mediterranean Corso, has its laws, its rules, its costumes, and its traditions that have a very long historical course. It is a low-intensity warfare, not only between two distinct communities that recognize each other as inimical, but like that cross over like all of the different communities in the Mediterranean with very different and interesting exchanges and crossovers. So in any case, before the late 17th century, we rarely hear of piracy in the Mediterranean, or at least we rarely hear any reference to Barbary pirate. And this is my first working hypothesis that I would like to put on the table for discussion. But what I would like to focus a bit more on is a second set of related questions, which Braudel only seems to suggest in passing. So given this distinction, this fundamental distinction between corsairs and pirates in the Mediterranean, how do we explain the gradual but inexorable terminological and conceptual confusion that grows and the conceptual shift between the classic conceptual couple corsairs, which is increasingly substituted and confused with the conceptual couple pirates. So should we simply discard this conceptual evolution as being the result of a growing terminological confusion, or is this symptomatic of much deeper material shifts? And my hypothesis, following a thesis that was already timidly advanced by Fernandez Duro, is that this terminological shift is symptomatic of a growing compenetration of the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. So I ask if maybe it could be useful to read again the history of the Mediterranean corsair in its last century at least, as part of a much wider history in which it appears to be increasingly absorbed, losing some of its historical specificity. So let's look a second, and I mean here really quickly at what is happening in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean around the same time. So we are towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So in the Atlantic war tradition, I think, which emerged during the 18th century, the prevailing definition of piracy is quite clear and hinges on the fundamental distinction between legitimate war by politically established societies, in particular the European states, and piratical violence. And therefore, pirates are defined as economically driven individuals, completely apolitical, operating independently from sovereign authorities. The essential problem that I think emerges much more clearly, which is already there in the history of the Atlantic, but which emerges much more clearly in the Pacific Ocean, in the Indian Ocean, and even more than in the Mediterranean, is the ambiguity of what is to be understood as a sovereign state, especially in the context of a complex cultural encounter between distant societies. So what defines the difference between a political community, a legitimate political community, and a piratical community? Is there a way to decide on the nature of a community that is scientific rather than political? So looking back at the history of European colonial strategies in the 19th century, it is glaring that the depoliticization implicit in the accusation of piracy has often been employed, at least, as a political instrument legitimizing colonial expansionism. From the perspective of European international law, centered on the model of the modern state, extra-European communities often seem to lack the necessary standards of civilization to be accepted as legitimate societies. Their violence was therefore more easily constructed as piratical in nature rather than being simply representative of war in its many forms. For instance, according to my study of British colonialism in 18th century India, the fact that Malabar's pirates were never recognized as political actors is predominantly due to the pervading influence of the European historical experience, specifically the model of the nation-state and its resultant regimes of territoriality. The assumption of absent or deficient political organization has characterized the construction of Asian piracy in European sources and historiography. In the 19th century, I think what is particularly interesting is that colonial powers not only refer to corsairs and pirates, as in there are corsairs sailing off Algiers, for example, but there is an increasing tendency to essentialize communal identities, and European and Western power increasingly refer to piratical communities and even pirate states. The difference is, I think, minimal but fundamental. It is one thing to say there are corsairs sailing off Algiers, and it's a different thing to say Algiers is a piratical community or Algiers is a piratical state. So obviously I won't have the time to go into detail of that, but I think one of the very first references to this paradoxical concept of the pirate state as a community at once included and excluded from the international state system in a Mediterranean context is contained in the so-called Proposal for Concerted Operation Among the Powers in Conflict with the Piratical States of Barbary, a document presented to the European diplomatic community in Paris by Thomas Jefferson in 1786, and whose wider goal was to change the Barbary's habits and characters from a predatory to an agricultural people. So piracy is not something that is just conducted by some people being somewhere. It's part of the character and the habits of a particular population. So I won't go into detail, but in the following historiographical literature that follows the French colonization in the 1830, this representation of piracy, I think, becomes more and more hegemonic, and the Mediterranean corso in its specificity is kind of erased and substituted by an image of the Mediterranean as a growing commercial arena chronically plagued by the parasitical piracies of North African people. So the two-sided, or like many-sided really, nature of maritime struggle in the Mediterranean has been erased. So this is the Barbary legend, and I think we did a great job during the conference to kind of work against that. I think this legend or myth is very operative today as well. Okay. So I will limit myself to like 3 very quick examples of the way in which this myth has been operative in the last 150 years, if you want. The first one, in the Magellan pirate case of 1853. Britain, I think, not only claimed the right to treat as outlaws foreign insurgents, and I think this is particularly important for the colonial sphere, but it also suggested the possibility that entire states may be considered pirates and treated accordingly. And in the official statement by the British Court of Admiralty, it is concluded that even an independent state may be guilty of piratical acts. What were the Barbary pirates of olden times? What many of the African tribes at this very moment? It is, I believe, notorious that tribes now inhabiting the African coast will send out their boats and capture any ship becalmed upon their coasts. Are they not pirates? Because perhaps their whole livelihood may not depend on piratical acts. This is the British Court of Admiralty in 1853. So I think the Barbary pirates are used as a precedent in an interesting way. Another example that I want to pose, I think, is interesting in many different ways, happens during the naval blockade of Germany in 1919. In that dramatic context, following the armistice and just preceding the Conference of Versailles, the Low Quarterly Review in its 35th issue published what at first view can only appear a most untimely article, titled Piracy and the Barbary Corsairs. Behind the scholarly title, there is actually a strong argument in support of treating Germany as a pirate state and all German officials as pirates, subject to universal jurisdiction. It was signed by no less than the Queen Professor of Comparative Law at the University of London, Julius de Montmorency, then one of the most influential legal authorities in the English-speaking world. With an original twist of perspective, de Montmorency proposes to use the colonial concept of piracy and this myth as a model which should be used and universally applied in order to reform the entire structure of international law and order. And he says it may be said that it's difficult to create precedents, that there is no precedent for pirate states, but in fact there is one great precedent which is written large across the history of Europe during a period of at least 3 centuries, the case of the Corsairs who flew the flag and carried the commissions of the sovereign Barbary states. As I think David presented very well in the very first speech of this conference, this is used, and also today to a certain extent, and it was used before Afghanistan in 2001, in Iraq 2003, in Libya 2011. There were attempts to use this Barbary myth in order to support the transformation of international society. So to conclude, if there is an analogy between our contemporary international society and the Mediterranean of the 19th century, it is almost exactly the opposite of what much popular and some official belief holds true. In the 19th century, the aggressive use of exogenous concepts, such as the one of the so-called pirate states, had an important role in the transformation of the Mediterranean from a pluralist international society, where polities from the northern and the southern shore were seen as different, conflictual, but equal, to an increasingly unequal order opposing legitimate European states to the pirate states of the southern shore. So today, this historical precedent is evoked in order to legitimize new discriminatory concepts such as the one of rogue state and outlaw states. Now and then, the discipline of history will not be a neutral witness, but rather an active player in the social construction of the Mediterranean world.